Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. But before we start, we call this History on Tap, and we initialize it as HOT for hot, and I think that's rather fitting this afternoon. But welcome, everyone, to the Cantilever and the opening event of Rainier Days 2025. I am Mike Williams, president of your Historical Society. And to my left, I have the two young ladies, Brianna Hamill, who is our assistant director, and then Ashley Levine, who is our executive director. This evening, we're going to be discussing the theme of this year's Rainier Days, which is Gold Rush. But before we begin, I want to thank the Cantilever for hosting this event. I also want to thank the Rainier Days Committee for inviting us back again. And a special thanks for Jeff McCarg for his sound system. Without it, we would not be able to do it, so we should give Jeff a hand. Then Darcy Sullivan is filming for KCTV. Next winter now, when it's 40 below, you'll be able to watch this. And but most of all, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. We wouldn't do it, if it wasn't for you. But when one thinks of gold mining in North America, the state of Minnesota is not very high on the list. We are known for our iron mines, which were the largest and most productive in the world at one time. But gold mines, at least for me growing up, were not here. They were in California, the Black Hills, the Klondike, but definitely not Minnesota. However, Minnesota has had three significant gold rushes in its history. The first one on the Zumbro River near Rochester, in 1858, 1859. And it was followed shortly after by a gold rush on Lake Vermilion, 1865, 1866. And then right here on Rainy Lake, we had ours beginning in 1893. All were short-lived, but the only one that ever produced a profit was right here on Little American Island. Ashley?
So there was a gentleman by the name of C.A. Moore, and he was a capitalist that was developing a mine on Lake of the Woods. And he decided that he thought that he might be able to entice investors in the Duluth area if gold could be found on Rainy Lake. So Moore grub-staked or financially backed an individual. He was a former Black Hills prospector by the name of George Davis. And he asked Davis to search for gold on Rainy Lake with the explicit instructions to not return unless he found something. So 3 months later, a local steamboat captain stepped into Moore's office carrying a 60-pound bag of samples that were, quote, glittering with nuggets and fine particles of visible gold. So Moore was obviously thrilled that something had been discovered. And it turns out that Davis just happened to camp out on an island one evening on Rainy Lake in late July of 1893, and he woke up in the morning and he began to explore the exposed veins of quartz there. And he crushed and panned several samples. One of them was about the size of a teacup, and he drew off 25 cents worth of gold. So he decided that he was going to stay and continue his explorations, and he sent word to Moore via steamboat. So Moore, again, being very excited about this, he decides that he's going to head to Rainy Lake. He meets up with Davis in Fort Francis, and they hire a small crew of men. There are about 5 of them, and they begin to work putting a shaft on the island, with the first blast being detonated on August 29, 1893. Now, Moore returned to Duluth with samples of quartz to assay, and the test showed an average of $98 to the ton, and that's about $3,500 in today's value. Now, I don't really know how gold mining works today, so I don't know if that's great by today's standards, but back then, that was incredible. So an association of Duluth businessmen very quickly paid Moore $10,000 for this 3-acre island, and by then it was known as Little American. And so the Bevier Mining and Milling Company was born. And this was formed by 2 Duluth partners, Hutchinson Bevier and A.S. Chase, and they made their way to Rainy Lake to seek their fortune, or so they thought. But travel to get to Rainy Lake was very difficult in 1893. It was definitely no easy task. You had over 100 miles of wilderness, particularly if you were traveling through the Tower Route. Now, there were three principal gold roads that people could take. We have a little map on our exhibit board. If you'd like to check that out, feel free after the show. And the main routes were the Tower route, the Port Arthur route, or the Winnipeg route. And the latter of the two, of course, were Canadian routes that people could take. Now, the Tower route ultimately had its terminus in Duluth with the railroad there. So people would come to Duluth and they would get on a train and they would take that to Tower, and then they would get on a steamboat. They would get to a portage where they would have to go 27 miles through nothing. There's no roads. It's just straight up wilderness, dragging their equipment or commercial supplies, get on another steamship, and then they would reach the Rainy Lake area. Altogether, that trip would take roughly 4 days. It would cost them about $6 to get here. But if you were an individual who was traveling very lightly, especially if you're coming maybe from Canada or somewhere else, those Canadian routes were a little bit more luxurious, but they cost $20. So, and it took a lot more time to get here. So for anyone that was traveling with a lot of gear, or again, they wanted to start a business, the Tower route was more cost effective, but it just really sucked. Now, of course, there are hundreds of travelers that are coming to the Rainy Lake region, but they need somewhere to live, right? So this is how Rainy Lake City becomes developed. So in anticipation of the gold boom, once again, there's another Duluth real estate developer. His name was William C. Sherwood, and he purchases 1,200 acres on Black Bay in December of 1893 from a gentleman by the name of Andrew Hilberry. And Andrew had just taken it up as like a random homestead. And then in the following March, Sherwood with his associates began to develop this town site. Now, within 6 weeks of surveying, Rainy Lake City had a pretty sizable population, but they lacked amenities. Like, these people were just living in tents or just free-balling out in the trees. And the village was then divided into 1,045 lots. And each lot was roughly 25 feet by 125 feet. And you could buy a residential lot for $100, or if you wanted some prime business lot, you'd have to pay $300 for this. And to put that into modern price perspective, it was $3,500 for a residential lot, or $10,700 for a business lot. And these lots are literally nothing. There's nothing on it, just a bunch of stumps or trees, and you had to do all of the work. Now, by the middle of March, they had sold 350 lots, and then they reserved 100 more lots for a stamp mill, 2 sawmills, and a docking area. And there was a group called the Rainy Lake Improvement Company that had contracted with a Mr. James Kirkwood that was going to operate this sawmill and supply the town site with 800,000 board feet of lumber. Yet despite the fact that this lumber mill was running 24 hours, 7 days a week, they could not keep up with the demand for these people to build homes or anything. So by April, the newspaper in Tower reported the status of Rainy Lake City, stating, "There are only 16 saloons at present, but the people have faith there are more to come. The population of Rainy Lake City sits at 214, 11 of whom are female, and the buildings are 7 log houses and 27 tents." So not a lot there. The village for sure had all of the characteristics of a Wild West town. They really didn't have a lot of really any law enforcement. You could just get shot in the street for looking at somebody wrong. But they decided that they were going to call a meeting, and they called a meeting in the parlor of the American Hotel, and they gathered a petition with 175 signatures. And this was to secure basically the organization of the city, and they presented that to the county, and Rainy Lake City would be formally incorporated on May 17th, 1894.
Well, as Ashley said, it started out with only about 214 residents, but at its peak, Rainy Lake City grew to about 500 residents and around 50 businesses. So you could say that Rainy Lake City was definitely hopping, especially when you consider that nearly half of these businesses were saloons. Because what does every gold miner on leave need if not a bar, a brawl, and a brothel? Of which there were suspected to be several. Other businesses amongst Rainy Lake City's 7 avenues and 4 streets were the Rainy Lake Journal. It's the city's first newspaper and one of the first businesses to pop up. Another of its early businesses was the Green Tree Hotel. This is one of 4 hotels in our quaint little town. Others included the Lakeshore House Hotel, that also housed a watchmaking and a jewelry shop run by J.B. Brenbeck, the American House, owned by E.B. Corey, which was said to be a first-class hotel in which only the most prestigious of visitors got to stay. The Rainy Lake Hotel, which was conveniently located above, you guessed it, a saloon, owned by Patrick Corrigan and Patrick Roque. And if I had to guess, I'd say is probably one of the bars that also had a brothel. Because, let's be honest, that would just be very convenient. Many of the town's businesses were built by a contractor by the name of Theodore Freytag, who I would say it's probably no coincidence specialized in building saloons. Not long after the construction of the town, however, he decided to move to Canada to try his hand at prospecting, because apparently building 17 saloons isn't as lucrative as you would think. Now, of course, it wasn't a town filled with nothing but hotels and saloons. There was also a brick manufacturing company owned by James Tierney and Patrick Roque, a Kirk and Rhinebeck Lumber Company, Rainy Lake Transit Company, owned by H.W. Robinson, who also had a furniture, insurance, explosives, and safe company. Because, by golly, he was going to do it all. There was a B.F. Turnbull Builders Hardware, as well as a hardware store run by the Lang brothers, Frank and John, who, given that there were 2 of them, kind of seemed like underachievers compared to old Mr. Robinson. There was another furniture store run by T.W. Shaw, who is said to have furniture as fine as Eastern factories. He also happened to be the city clerk and the justice of the peace. There was also a law office run by E.E. Neal, who was also the U.S. Court Commissioner. J.B. Berg and Company, which was owned and operated by a former iron miner, John Berg, who unfortunately lost his arm in a mining accident and decided to head to the land of opportunity to sell dry goods, groceries, boots, clothing, books, drugs, periodicals, and smoking supplies to the men of his former trade. He also happened to be the city council president. So, the Lang brothers look more and more unmotivated every day. It was also a well-known fact and common complaint that prices were quite high in this little city of gold compared to others in the area. Need to feed your growing family of 10? You can grab a moose carcass from the local butcher for a whopping $5. Room and board ran anywhere from $7 to $10 per week. Need a shave or maybe a haircut? It's fine, but you're looking at shelling out at least 25 to 50 cents. But why do that when you could also just make the 13-mile trek to Fort Frances and pay half the price? This small community was also home to 3 grocery stores and dry goods stores, 2 restaurants, a post office, a school, and even, and this is a rarity back then, a doctor's office. Though I'm not sure how much help the doctor would have been back then. Medicine in the 1890s definitely left something to be desired. In fact, illness was so much a part of life that you probably didn't even really qualify as being sick, depending on your illness. If you have malarial fever, shoot, you're not sick, you just got the UGG. I'm not sure what UGG means, but malaria was so rampant in the area that Rainy Lake Journal published an article in September of 1894 urging townsfolk to have better sanitation practices, which back then is kind of a big deal. That's not something people really thought much of. Typhoid fever was also so bad in the area a few years prior, so it would have likely been in Couchiching, that they actually printed in the paper a warning to make sure that you're drinking clean water, should you be able to find it. Tuberculosis was another disease that was very common in the area. Unfortunately, this one kind of defied doctors at the time. There was really nothing that they could do for TB. Most doctors didn't even really give it much thought, particularly to how the disease was spread. And germ theory had did gain prominence in the mid-19th century, but we're so far or so secluded up here that most people either didn't really hear about it, didn't fully understand it. At that point, newer ideas like that people mostly thought were rubbish. But even still, the connection between microorganisms, hygiene, and sanitation practices, like I said, just were not, the connection was not made there. So much so that even the doctors kind of thought it was bogus. They used to take pride in how infrequently they would wash their hands. On top of that, in many hospitals, the doctor whose lab coat was covered in the most blood, guts, and heaven only knows what, usually earned strutting rights around the hospital that day. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, and it's likely no surprise to you that more often than not, people didn't really make it back out of the hospital. And it was for that reason that up in the frontier, that reason and traveling so far when you're that ill meant it was a long, strenuous journey, and you probably wouldn't survive it anyway. So, that being said, many people turned to quacks, local druggists, snake oil salesmen, or just your grandma. And as I said, there was a local doctor in Rainy Lake City, but back then, the term doctor could pretty much be applied to anyone who wanted it, or had the charm and charisma to sell you a fancy bottle of some stinky liquid. Most of them sold these cure-alls, made up of whatever they could find lying around. But whatever it was sure to cure what you got. Some of the biggest medicines of the time were laudanum, whiskey or chloroform for pain, which most people preferred the former, doctors included, cocaine from everything for dental surgery to hay fever to morphine addiction. Now I know what you're thinking, but fear not. If you get addicted to the cocaine, they did have a remedy for that, called it heroin. Many medicines also contained mercury, and I'm guessing I don't have to tell you how well that went. Not to say that every person claiming to be a doctor didn't know what they were doing. Many did, and plenty of actual doctors of the time did know how to do things like check temperature, check pulse, look at your overall appearance, check your skin, even look at your tongue. Many were trained in at least superficial examination, so they had that. Thermometers were new around the time. Some used them. Some thought your hand was as good as anything. As a mother, I kind of agree. However, saddlebag doctors rarely had access to medicine, so they could do the examination, but they might not have proper medicine for you. More often than not, they would have to improvise. They would use poultices of flaxseed and cornmeal for pneumonia. Syrup of figs was used as a laxative, or herbed oils for sprains, strains, and bruises. Red pepper, mustard seed, and herbal teas were also commonly used. But as I said, you could also just ask your grandma. Mothers and grandmothers of the time used what they could find. Women usually took more of a preventative approach than anything, using things like lime juice to help combat summer complaints or digestive issues in children. Garlic and onion were used to fight cold and flu, more often than not, home remedies and improvisations of saddlebag doctors were actually surprisingly successful.
Thank you, Ashley and Brianna. Every boom town, a frontier town like Rainy Lake City, had its share of notorious characters, and of course Rainy Lake City was no exception. The first one I want to talk about is James Dunn, also known as Goldbug Jimmy. He was a prospector and a con artist. His MO was to load his shotgun with gold flakes and then blast it into a rocky slope. Then after filing a claim on it, he would then offer to sell it to an unsuspecting speculator. It would work, it did work, and it worked a lot for him, and he got a lot of grub stakes. But Rainy Lake City had its own bank, and it was owned and operated by a man by the name of W.W. Butler. One June evening in 1895, he ran out of the bank hollering that the bank had just been robbed. Apparently, two men came in at closing time and needed change for a large bill. When Butler opened the safe, they overcame him and then disappeared with the contents. The depositors then organized a search but came up empty. Meanwhile, Butler hired a canoe and took off east towards Kettle Falls, supposedly to replace the stolen money. The townfolk immediately suspected that Butler had robbed his own bank and took off after him. He was overtaken near Tower and returned to Rainy Lake City with the money. But another version of this incident is that the returned money was actually a replacement for the stolen cash. Either way, the depositors got their money, and only two decided to quit the bank. But no matter what version that you agree with on this, is that the bank was robbed, the money was returned, and no one went to jail. But we all know that guns and alcohol are a poor mixture, and Rainy Lake City had plenty of both of them. James Turney was said to be a nice guy and a crack shot with his .45 revolver, although his personality changed when he was under the influence of alcohol. One afternoon, another local character, Paddy the Bird, emerged from the saloon with a bottle of whiskey, and he was about to take a swig. Turney shot the bottle. The bottle exploded, and glass fragments hit Paddy in the face. He immediately screamed, "I've been killed," and fell into a dead faint. Shortly after, he awoke unhurt. Another time, Turney entered a butcher shop and ordered some sausages. They were suspended from the ceiling, and when the clerk was slow to retrieve them, he promptly shot the strings and dropped them to the floor. One day, Turney entered the saloon and ordered a drink. He paid with a $5 bill, and the bartender said there would be no change. And Turney replied, "Then I'll ring it up for you." He proceeded to empty the .45 into the till. Needless to say, he got his change. But sometimes things got a little bloody. One day, two local toughs who had been terrorizing the city of Rainy Lake City walked into Corrigan's saloon. They were Boston O'Brien and Del Clark. After a few words, O'Brien knocked Corrigan to the floor, pulled out his pistol, and began shooting at Corrigan's feet. He then shot at Corrigan's head, but missed. Corrigan then retrieved his own pistol, followed the two out in the street, and shot at O'Brien 3 times, striking him in the throat and the cheek. Both wounds were deemed to be fatal, but O'Brien somehow survived. Both men returned to the city months later, but believe me, they stayed plenty clear of Corrigan's saloon. But the judge eventually ruled that Corrigan shot in self-defense. But the most publicized shooting in Rainy Lake City took place on a bitterly cold night in February of 1901. The two men involved were Bill Randolph of Kettle Falls and Spike, or One-Arm Sullivan, of the city. The two could not have been more opposite. Bill Randolph was a good man and was delivering mail by dog team. Sullivan, on the other hand, was described as a good-for-nothing bum. He was the manager of the Lakeshore House, the only lodging establishment open in Rainy Lake City at that time. The two men knew each other. They had had a falling out sometime earlier, and Sullivan boasted that he would shoot Randolph on sight if he ever came to Rainy Lake City. It's not known if Randolph knew of Sullivan's intentions, but he needed a place to stay. After securing his dogs, he entered the Lakeshore House with his pack and a 12-gauge shotgun. What happened next happened quickly. Upon spotting Randolph, Sullivan opened fire with his .38 caliber revolver. Randolph was hit in the right ear and the right side. He responded with a single shot from his shotgun into Sullivan's chest, killing him instantly. Randolph then left the saloon, hitched up his team, and went to Fort Frances for medical treatment. He later recovered and was arrested for murder after returning to the United States. The trial was held in Grand Rapids, the county seat, and he was found guilty. However, there was an appeal, and the judge threw out the verdict when it was learned that the bailiff had supplied liquor to the jury. Now, I've been on jury duty a few times, and that never happened to me. There was a second trial, and Bill Randolph was acquitted. But Bill and his wife, Kate, lived at Kettle Falls for many years and then left for Crane Lake, where they built and operated Borderland Lodge for a long time. Ashley?
All right, so we're gonna get back into a little bit more technical stuff. So this is all about getting into like the meat of actual mining. While many prospected throughout the Rainy Lake region, there were only a couple of locations that actually proved to be somewhat fruitful and worthwhile for prospectors to continue to participate in. Now, Little American Mine was truly one of the only properties that was actively producing ore, because mining on Rainy Lake required several things. It required patience, it required a lot of machinery, experience, and a constant supply of money to extract the ore from the hard veins of quartz. At Little American, a crew opened an adit, or a single-ended horizontal shaft onto the west end of the island, and the initial results proved pretty promising. So the miners proceeded to open a vertical shaft to a depth of about 45 feet. By June of 1894, there were double shifts of men working day and night, sinking a shaft onto this island, and they were beginning the work of running a stope, or a chamber, at a 50-foot level. And this crew generally numbered anywhere between 10 and 20 men, and they were living on the island, and they were paid an average wage of about $2 to $2.25 per day for the miners, and for just general laborers, they were earning $1.50 to $1.75. I did not look up what that is today, but I'm guessing it's still not very much. The Bevier Company ended up hiring a machinist to oversee installation of a stamp mill, but the stamp mill was located on Rainy Lake City. It was not on the island itself, on the Little American Island. And it was started on July 4th of 1894 to start processing ore. And so this was a huge part of their 4th of July celebration, because they live in the middle of nowhere and there's not a whole lot else to celebrate other than yay America. So they process the ore from Little American, and their first process is really great. It's super rich. And so after their second and third runs of the mill, proving to be just as rich as the first, there was very little room for doubt that Little American was probably going to be a prosperous mine, especially once they had sent gold off to be, turned into gold pieces, and they were getting $20 gold pieces returned from the U.S. Mint that had been made out of Rainy Lake gold. However, this company faced a lot of obstacles, including raising enough capital to continue operations. So despite that they had very rich ore, the Bevier Company was unhappy with their operations at Little American, and after 6 weeks of work, they ended up shutting down the mine and the stamp mill. And their process was just simply too inefficient. They ran for 40 days, they crushed 320 tons of ore, and yielded only about $5,024 worth of gold. So back then that sounds like a lot, but until we get to how much it cost to actually run it, they really didn't make that much money. Now, Little American lays idle until October of 1894, and improvements are made, and a new lease was signed that required deeper shafts to be sunk, and a second shaft also had to be installed. And that produced another 150 tons of ore, but then it was shut down again until 1896. So why does it suck to mine on Rainy Lake? So there are two types of mining for gold that you can do. Mining on Rainy Lake is considered hard rock or lode mining. And in comparison to gold fields in California or Alaska, those people were engaged in placer mining. Placer mining is where gold erodes from the veins or lodes in the mountains and it washes down into the streams, and you can easily just pan the gold. You could just walk by and be like, oh, look, there's some gold, and you just shake it out. You can't do that on Rainy Lake. The gold-bearing quartz veins of Rainy Lake are found in a belt of rock schists, and this is known as the Rainy Lake Seine River Fault, and we also have a map of that on our exhibit if you would like to look at that. So from Little American Island, where the gold was discovered, this rock belt extends 124 miles to the east into Canada and 50 miles west. Now, the veins of quartz vary in width. They don't follow any particular pattern. So you have to have some kind of basic understanding of geology to know their potential. So frequent assays are made from these samples to determine the quantity and quality of the gold. So a skilled prospector can then extrapolate whatever information they can get from this about the character of the vein below them, whatever they're working in, and determine if this is something that they want to spend time on. Now, once a mine has determined that there is gold-bearing ore that can be mined in a profitable quantity, a treatment plant would then be, established for them to retrieve these precious metals. And then you can either do this in a form of free milling the ore or refractory milling. Now, free milling means that the gold is just found in its natural state, as if you were doing placer mining. Now, refractory ore is much more difficult to treat. Again, we have that process on the board if you want to learn more about it. But that's where it contains mixtures of other minerals like lead, zinc, pyrite, and it has to be extracted so you can have the pure gold form. And on Rainy Lake, it generally starts out as free milling, and then the deeper they get into the mine shafts, it needs refractory milling to be fully processed. Now, Little American Mine, it was capable of processing 20 tons of ore per day, and during a 12-day period, they crushed 200 tons of ore and produced a 100-ounce brick that was worth $2,000. However, the mill consumed 4 cords of wood every 24 hours to run, and the operation cost about $100 per day to mine and mill the ore from Little American. So if we remember, when they did those 40 days or whatever, and they only made $5,000, it cost them $4,000 just to run. So they're really not making that much money for all of the effort that they're putting in. Now, there were other mines on Rainy Lake, of course. The only other one to ever rival Little American was the Lyle Mine. This is located on the north shore of Dryweed Island, and it was first explored in the winter of 1893 to 1894. And the Rainy Lake Journal reputed that the Lyle Mine is showing itself to be a mineral wonder, with returns of the assays showing the rock is worth $30.90 per ton, and these were later increased to about $42 per ton. And that site boasted a 40-stamp mill, which was the ore crusher. They had a steam pump, they had an electric light plant, and the mine shaft was over 100 feet deep. A generous amount of money was put into that mine by the Lyle Mining Company, but in 1896 it kind of became apparent that this mine really wasn't that great, so they just stopped operation. There was another mine located on Dryweed on the north end, and that was Old Soldier Mine, but it only produced small amounts of gold, so again, another waste of time. Bushy Head Mine was the only mine that could be prospected immediately, explored by a horizontal tunnel, which of course we all know is visible today. If you go out on the lake and you drive by, you can see it. But that was present with gold and silver potential, but it was very difficult for them to mine that as well. Most mines were within 5 miles of Rainy Lake City, but because it was so difficult with the failure of the mines, that's part of the reason why Rainy Lake City ultimately didn't make it. But I did mention that Little American Mine does come back in 1896. So in 1895, its owners closed operations because of mismanagement and because they just didn't have enough money. They did not have very efficient mining equipment or practices. But in 1896, the Lyle Mining Company decided that they wanted to invest in it. So they made improvements and they had successful mining endeavors. But unfortunately, they were plagued with some conflict-like issues, and they had mined an entire season, and then in May of 1897, they docked at Little American, and the dock broke. It sank all of their stuff that they had dropped there. and they lost an entire season worth of ore. So all of their gold was gone, and it sits at the bottom of Rainy Lake today, somewhere. So eventually the closure of the Little American mine, and then it was seized by the Itasca County Sheriff, I don't know why, kind of delivered one of the final death blows to Rainy Lake City.
Even though the gold mines on the Minnesota side of Rainy Lake ceased to operate in the early part of the 20th century, some of those on the Ontario side, up in the Seine River area near Mine Center, continue to produce gold for some years after. But currently, there's a large gold mining operation located just west of Fort Frances, near Barwick, near Emo, called New Gold. And it's listed on both the New York and Toronto stock exchanges. It is producing gold, but with any investment, somebody should look into it before you actually do invest. But if you want to find some gold on your own and don't want to travel far, there are places in Minnesota where at least you have a chance. One of those is on the Rainy River, fairly close to Baudette. And the other is on the Big Fork River, down on the Effie end. You most likely won't find anything, but at least it'll be fun trying. But if you're serious about making money with gold, I think you're much better off by just coming out and buying it or buying gold stock. But I want to thank all of you again for attending this very, very warm evening, and we can take questions at this time. Oh yes, yeah, Rainy Lake City, it's interesting. It's all growing up and all the original buildings are gone. But if you go first thing in the spring when the vegetation's down or in the fall when it's down, you can still see the wagon ruts that eroded the part of the streets. And then there's a lot of, if the water's low, you can find just a lot of, metal mostly. But laying on the banks. I know the last time I was there, I found, 7 or 8 double-bladed axe blades in a pile. I left them. I had no need for them. But it is interesting to stop there. But there's plenty of wood ticks, I'll tell you that. Yeah, the only building that's there, a resort, small resort, was built there, and I believe it was the late 30s. And that's the only building remaining from that resort. But the park eventually, is going to put in a decent dock there, and informational, kiosks, and I suppose picnic tables, and a restroom. It is a very interesting place to stop. I want to leave all of you with a thought for the day. I'm going to do this on everyone after this. But the world needs more kind people. If you cannot find one, then be one. But thank you this evening.